I want to welcome everyone for being here. I'm Richard, and this is our 29. Wow,
20?
You told me, Kim.
28 and a half.
Okay.
I think it's 29.
This is our 29th Law Salon, and I'm really happy everyone's here. And Paul, you're going to be talking. We have two speakers today, Paul and Leslie. Good job, you got here. Good. I just want Paul to start talking. Let me introduce Paul just a little better than that. Paul and I met.
I'll let you do that if you stand a little closer. Oh. Beautiful. Yes.
Okay, Paul and I met at the archives of the Union Rescue Mission at 6th and San Pedro. The Union Rescue Mission has been on Skid Row for 122 years. Union Rescue Mission is a really great place. Their archive is really important. Both Paul and I can attest to that. We're working on dealing with questions of accession with the board right now, which I hope get resolved Monday or Tuesday. Yeah. Keep that in your thoughts. So Paul is going to talk about Lyman Stewart and Lyman Stewart's outreach to Los Angeles through these women he contracted to do social work. Lyman Stewart, Paul's going to kick me now. Lyman Stewart, you may know from the Paul Thomas Anderson film, There Will Be Blood. The oilman is a composite of many oilmen of that era, and Lyman Stewart is one of the men that make up that composite. I know you're grimacing, but everyone's seen the Paul Thomas Anderson film, so it's a great touchstone. It's not Lyman Stewart, but it's a little bit. So Paul, just take it away. This is one last thing. You helped us give this great walk 2 weeks ago.
It was wonderful.
3 weeks ago, November 10th, Thursday, November 10th.
October 10th.
It's only October. Thursday, October 10th, Reverend Andy of the Union Rescue Mission, Paul and I and our friend Nathan gave a tour of Skid Row. We talked about the different headquarters the Union Rescue Mission's had in Skid Row for 422 years. And then we went back to its present location and watched this great film from 1949, which the Union Rescue Mission made, called A Scrap and Still. You and your husband were there a couple years ago when we did that. It's a lot of fun. So Paul's great. We love working with him. Take it away.
Thank you, Richard. My wife Judith and son Joshua are here, so I'm happy to have a few friends in the audience. But I'm looking forward to this talk about women today, and we could talk about two more different groups. And I'm looking forward to Leslie's talk after mine on the burlesque girls of Los Angeles. And when Richard set this up and asked me to do this talk, I didn't know what I was in for, in terms of contrasts. But he thought this would be a good idea, so let's let it happen. I was puzzled the first time I heard the word Bible women. I don't know what that image conjures up in your mind. It may be pictures of women like this. I kind of thought like Dana Carvey's, church lady image, on Saturday Night Live. Remember that? Or maybe you went to Sunday school as a young child and have some image of some old teacher, in out-of-fashion clothing or what have you, but I was in for an eye-opening experience to discover who the Bible women really were. Let me show you a few group pictures of Bible women in 1920 and 1930. This is when Lyman Stewart's vision for a Bible women ministry in Los Angeles was more organized. In fact, it was a department of the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. And the leading ladies during this organized period were Mrs. Lyman Stewart, Lula Stewart, that I have identified here, and the superintendent of the Bible Institute's wife, Anna, or Mama Horton. And Mama Horton passed away in 1921, and the younger Mrs. Stewart, this is Lyman's second wife, she was 30 years younger than Lyman. She took over the Bible Women and continued to lead it through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and about the 1950s, the Bible Women had died off. She was the last, in fact. She died in 1963. So I had heard of these Bible women, but I really didn't know much about them until I started writing a biography of Lyman Stewart, and I've been at it for 5 years. He left us a lot of documents. Here's a picture of Bible woman Mrs. Lyman Stewart, Lula, when she donated his personal papers to the Biola Archive Library. This is actually just one table. Lyman was a very thrifty Scot businessman. He saved every receipt, every letter, every business record. It's all there, which is wonderful for me. He's never had a biographer, really. So I hope that he's left me enough evidence to really appreciate his life.
Paul, do you just want to talk about access to that archive just for a second? If people want to look at the papers, maybe?
We have an archive at Biola, and there are scholars over the past 30 or 40 years who found it very valuable. From Harvard, University of Chicago, Cambridge, and others, UCLA, USC. But, this is a narrow field of interest, and so I'm about the only archivist or the scholar working in the archives currently, although we have visitors come, a few every year. It's difficult to arrange for access, okay? It's not publicly open, but you can arrange for access. And for serious scholars of American religion, especially, or social history, it's certainly of value. Here's some pictures of the Bible women and the story I want to tell you today, which is not the story of the later years when this was a more organized operation. In fact, there's no book that's been written about the Bible women, no official story, and the founder of the department at Biola, Mrs. Horton, said there will never be a story written about the Bible women, because the Bible women had individual, personal, confidential conversations, one-on-one with inside the homes of the people of Los Angeles. And so these are they're not committed to any written record. All I have is records that they made over 1 million visits to households in Los Angeles over the decades. And were active in personal visitation. We have an image maybe of like Jehovah's Witnesses, or Mormons, knocking on the door, making a visit, This kind of visit, which was very typical of evangelical Christian women of the Victorian era, actually involved a 2 or 3 hour visitation in which they came into the home, they got to know the people in the home who had needs, they shared their concerns, they prayed with them, they read the Bible. If they had a medical or a physical or a financial need, they tried to arrange for some way in which they could get aid to them. And so this was a very intense personal interaction. They really are the founders of what we would call the social worker case approach, to managing human problems. But there's no written record of those. So how do I reconstruct this story? It's because there are a few outstanding women who left some detailed personal letters in the early days of this work, from 1890 to 1920. And they sent these letters as monthly reports to Lyman Stewart, detailing the people they visited, the needs that they met, interesting little details about people of Los Angeles. And he paid them $25 a month. Okay, it doesn't sound like you could hardly live on that, right? $25 a month, it's actually close to $1,000 a month in today's purchasing power, if you can believe that. And he provided their shelter in a settlement house in Los Angeles, and provided them with a lot of other financial support as well. So although these were women living probably in abject poverty, they were like Catholic monastic sisters order, in which they had taken a vow of poverty to serve the community. Richard mentioned a little bit about Lyman Stewart, and I think that I need to tell you a little bit about him if you don't know about him. He was the originator of the Bible women concept in LA. But he's mostly known, if you ever have heard of him, as the co-founder of the Union Oil Company, its president for 25 years. And another major institution in early Los Angeles was right in the heart of downtown, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which the big edifice that is now a skyscraper is in its place, but it's right across the street from the Central Library. And it was the tallest building in LA when it was built in 1915. It was a...
Oh, 5 blocks west corner right there.
Here's an aerial photo in 1920, corner of 6th and Hope. In 1930s, during the Depression, the 2 towers of the Bible Institute had huge neon signs erected on the top, 24 feet high, that said, "Jesus saves." If you remember that, these signs still exist, even though the building doesn't, and there's a lot of controversy over what will happen to them. And they were erected, not by Lyman Stewart, he was gone, but by the people of the Bible Institute. My wife and I teach at Biola University, which is moved from downtown to La Mirada. It's kind of a typical comprehensive Christian college today, although it remains distinctive and being very committed to the founding principles and doctrines of Lyman Stewart and the early evangelicals that founded Biola stands for Bible Institute of Los Angeles, without the little dots. They just changed it into that name. Richard mentioned that the Union Rescue Mission is also an important institution in LA that's been existing for 121 years. I'll talk about it in this talk. And also a co-founder of the YMCA, and a founding trustee of Occidental College, which was a Presbyterian college, founded first in downtown LA before it moved out to Eagle Rock. And Lyman Stewart served on the board and was a major donor during the first 2 decades of Occidental. He directed most of his work later on, though, into the urban gospel mission work in the Bible Institute. When he died in 1923, he was an outstanding figure in Los Angeles. The front page of the Times mourned his loss. Let me read a couple things that they said about him, just to get a sense of what this man meant to Los Angeles. The Petroleum World, which was the leading journal of the American petroleum industry, paid tribute to what they called the life of this revered veteran of oil, long given the honor title Dean of the Western Oil Men. Consulted by the oldest and wisest, held in respectful awe by the younger element, 83 years old when this gentle soul was called home. His name was known wherever oil was spoken. His 80 years of square dealing in business and kind personal interest in all around him have earned him the friendship and respect of thousands. You look at any prominent oil history, like Daniel Yergin's The Prize, he will figure prominently as a pioneer. The first oil refinery in California, the first oil pipeline system, the first petroleum storage tanks, which are ubiquitous around us right now, big steel storage tanks. They were called Stewart tank farms when they were invented by Lyman Stewart. He invented them for receptacles to hold oil and then pipe the oil to the various points of the refinery around the country. He discovered and exploited the Santa Maria and Kern County oil fields. At their time, they were the biggest in the world. Stewart's also noted by religious historians for the religious work that I'm going to talk about today as a leader of early evangelicalism. Jewish historians note him as a leading and early proto-Christian Zionist, one of the earliest supporters of Zionism, very friendly with the Jewish community here in Los Angeles. Isaiah Hellman, the chairman of the Farmers and Merchants Bank, was really his partner He was a financial partner of the Union Oil Company, and he was on very positive and friendly relations with the Jewish business community. His controller was Samuel Kahan, the son of a Los Angeles rabbi. So, unusual for... in China and Korea, he's known for founding Bible institutes like the one here in Los Angeles in China. Here's one in Hunan province that was founded, built by him between 1915 and 1921, and 6 Bible institutes in Korea. We have many Korean students at Biola today that are descendants of early converts, of Presbyterian missionaries who went to Korea over a century ago. But his real business was oil, and he was in the oil industry from the very beginning. He came out to California in 1883 as part of the first oil exploration expedition. He'd been told by his partner from Titusville, Harvey Hardison, that there were seeps of oil coming out of the mountainsides in the Tehachapies when they were constructing the railroad between the Union Pacific and here in Los Angeles. They were cutting through the Tehachapies, and they said, there's oil seeping out of here. And so he got together some investors and a team of Pennsylvania oil men, and they paid 6 months' wages in advance, and they said, we're going to drill, and we're going to find oil, which they drilled for 6 months and lost all their money. And at the end of this time, he went to some other petroleum prospectors that were in the region, and he said, look, I've got no money, but I've got a crew. We're here. Can we partner with you? Which he did. And they said, sure, we'll cut you in. And fortunately, after they formed the partnership, they struck oil. Their 7th deep well. This, by the way, is when he went to Isaiah Hillman and got a loan to actually begin and continue his venture out here. Interesting stories. In fact, yeah, let me tell you. I knew that would happen. I'm not too technically adept. Interesting stories about what happened here. I told you he got into this partnership, but unfortunately his partners cut him out when they found oil, and they said, well, we hadn't really executed this partnership agreement, so we'll pay your crew, but you don't have any ownership in what we've discovered. Lyman wrote back to his pastor of his Titusville Presbyterian Church at the time. Dear Pastor, for a long time the wells failed us, but when we finally began to have some success, the men in whom we trusted failed us. And this latter failure hurts us more than did the former. I'm so heartsick and weary with this perplexing business that it seems I could not endure the strain for a single day, were it not that I, in my sheer helplessness, am impelled from time to time to flee from my work and call on my dear Heavenly Father for His sustaining grace. Business is now a great burden to me, but I lay it on the great burden bearer. How precious He is to me in these days of perplexity. How much I need your prayers, my dear brother, that I may be guided aright and sustained through all that is before me. This is the kind of letter that tells you a lot about Lyman Stewart, okay? And he did write in King James English for about 10 years, and after living here in LA for a while, it kind of wore off, and he spoke a little bit more plain English. He wrote to his brother a few weeks later, "The Lord in His mercy has removed the cloud that seemed so impenetrable. Thanks and praise be to His name. I hope and pray that I may not forget this lesson, that I may again slight the teaching of His Word." I'll wrap this up shortly. This gives us some insight into his focus of practicing faith. Within his work, he was a most unusual California businessman. Those who examine his early Union Oil business philosophy note that he did very consistent things that were consistent with his Christian faith. He built family-friendly communities with Union Oil workers at all of their remote drilling operations. Company paid chaplains traveling a circuit to teach Bible, establish local congregations, minister to the needs of workers and families. He was a big advocate of local ordinances to ban saloons, gambling, and prostitution in all the Union Oil communities. These are the kinds of things that were lampooned by Upton Sinclair in his novel Oil, which There Will Be Blood was based on.
Right, let me interrupt you. Probably one of the most beautiful past scenes in the film There Will Be Blood is this wonderful voiceover as they're building this town, and they're basically, the narrator is enumerating what you just said. They're building these towns based on these principles, and it's not lampooned at all in some ways.
This was the real thing,
Yeah.
but in the Upton Sinclair novel, it was kind of a fraud. At least that was what he was trying to portray. Here's something that appeared on Lyman Stewart's annual stockholder statements, the annual report to shareholders. The blurb in the business page of the LA Times says, "Thankful for the blessings, President Lyman Stewart acknowledges the favor of the Lord in his annual report. More than $1.5 million paid in dividends." And just look at the first line of his letter on the shareholder report. "The Lord has greatly blessed and prospered the business of the Union Oil Company. Its motto has ever been pure good, full measure, and a square deal." Coupled with the scriptural admonition, "Acknowledge him, the Lord, in all thy ways, and he shall direct your paths." One final piece of evidence. This is a letter that I discovered written from his wife, Sarah. Usually good insights into a person's character. It's from your own wife. She wrote him a note, one she sent almost every day to him while she stayed back in Pennsylvania and he came out here with the exploration team to look for oil in the wilderness, really, of California. She says here, "It seems to me, my dear Lyman, I never knew a more consistent Christian, or one who kept in mind more constantly the injunction to watch and pray. I wish we were all as faithful in his service as you are, and as well prepared for whatever changes life or death may bring. I suppose there's a great opportunity for Christian work in that new, strange country, and that already you find plenty to do." This is says dated 1983, 100 years off. 1883, she wrote this to me. And Lyman did. Right away, as I mentioned, he devoted himself as a founding trustee and financial backer of institutions that still endure today, the YMCA, Occidental College. Here's a little notice in the paper that says Lyman Stewart of the Union Oil Company and O.T. Johnson have donated $34,000 to Occidental College. It's quite a sum of money back then. They were the two largest donors during the first 2 decades of the school. But most of interest to him was not these institutions where people had to come to you, in order to get help. Or he said, "I believe in bringing the Lord's work out to the people." And so this is where he began to involve himself with a network of evangelical, some would say fanatics, but very aggressive and devout, pious evangelical street workers. First was the wagons. This was horse and buggy covered wagon era still then. Okay, so this is how they got around. And they put ministers and organs and food and tables and tents, in these wagons and went to the worst neighborhoods in LA and set up street meetings. You've heard about these. And they did this for decades. I think they still commemorate this, from time to time, historically in Los Angeles, of the old gospel wagons and gospel wagon meetings.
Yeah, I don't think the URM's done it for about 30. They used to. They used to.
There aren't many wagons around anymore. Now, he didn't invent this, okay? He didn't make this up. He was actually working out of a historical context where for about 100 years, evangelical Protestants had been perfecting this urban work for quite some time. I'll mention just a few briefly. Historian David Bebbington, a British historian, writes that the first Bible women were the Strangers' Friend Society of London, founded in 1780. In Scotland, evangelical leader and politician Thomas Chalmers, who was also an economist at Edinburgh University, wrote a treatise on political economy in 1821 called The Christian and Civic Economy of Large Towns, in which he described a system of lay visitation in urban Glasgow, Scotland, that produced noteworthy moral, physical, and material transformation through a system of 1,500 trained volunteers who visited 35,000 poor families every 2 weeks. Imagine that. With material provisions, medical assistance, and personal spiritual encouragement. In the 1830s, in Dublin, Ireland, Catholic youngster Catherine Macaulay, who was of noble birth, but her parents died and she was taken over. Her foster parents were evangelical Protestants. She noticed, how engaged they were in urban mission activities, rather than the cloistered, Catholic missions, and she was very concerned about this. She decided to start her own Catholic, similar lay ministry. Lay workers, voluntary home visitors in the city of Dublin, and it met with immediate and enthusiastic response in the Roman Catholic parishes, to such an extent that the priest and the church hierarchy sought to prevent her from interfering and competing with the activities of the official religious orders. So rather than fight them, she said, "I'll join you," and she founded the Sisters of Mercy, which is the largest humanitarian and hospital organization, or at least one of the largest. Sisters of Charity, Daughters of Charity are also quite large. But the Sisters of Mercy is an order that they call themselves the Marching Nuns. They refused to wear habits or religious wear, and they said, "We will not be cloistered. We will go house to house and we will live in the neighborhoods," just like the Protestant evangelicals. There was a first Bible Women's Society in London, was Mrs. Ellen Ranyard. She founded a notable institution called the Bible Women Nurses Sisterhood. I think some of the TV programs that are serialized on British TV and Masterpiece Theatre that are about these home visitation nurses, are really based on these works of Ranyard and others. They were bona fide nurses who'd been trained in the Crimean War. They came back and they formed these sisterhoods and were involved in healing body and soul, house to house in London. In Chicago, within a decade or two, they were doing the same thing. There's an eminent woman by the name of Emma Dreyer who formed a work paralleling Ranyard's work in London. And she came to the attention of the Chicago revivalist and urban pastor Dwight Moody. He partnered with her, and she founded a training school in Chicago to train women and later men in urban Christian work. Today it's known as Moody Bible Institute, which is one of the oldest and largest urban Christian Bible institutes in the world. Chicago was going through a lot during this time. They had the Chicago Fire in 1871. Many people note the work that these Bible women did. They became quite notable. A severe depression and the Haymarket riot that resulted from social and labor unrest in Chicago caused a new organization to form in Chicago at the behest and request of D.L. Moody and Emma Dreyer, and they invited a young urban pastor in Minneapolis, Reuben Torrey, to come and lead this organization. He was 26 years old at the time. I think I've got it right. Or he was in his 20s, and very dynamic. And he had an urban work in Minneapolis that was doing similar things. He called it the Open Door Church. And he came to Chicago, and they had annual conferences where groups from all over the country, even the English-speaking world, would come to Chicago for these conferences and share techniques and ideas and support one another and get the capitalists that had a heart for Christian work to contribute to these these networks of urban missions. And interestingly, Reuben Torrey would later be brought to Los Angeles by Lyman Stewart to be the founding pastor of the Church of the Open Door when it was founded in 1915. So Lyman Stewart was observing all this going on in America, and he wanted it to happen in Los Angeles. Starting in 1888, he became the chief financial backer of a Christian settlement house, which became known as the San Fernando Mission. Later on, it was called the Good Samaritan Mission. It lasted for 2 decades and was the kind of nucleus of experiment for these urban works here in Los Angeles. Many people who started other missions had, at some point in time, lived in the San Fernando Mission. Here's a picture of it here.
Where is this?
You know, I've got addresses, and I tried to find it, but it's on San Fernando Street. It's north of downtown, but I'm sure we could find it, and I'd love to.
Lincoln Heights.
What?
San Fernando Road, Lincoln Heights.
Yeah.
On the other side of the river.
Yeah.
I love this picture of an early Bible woman, Belle White, making a house-to-house visitation. She was one of the earliest and most effective and most beloved of the early Bible women supported by Lyman Stewart. Another group that Lyman Stewart supported was over at the Soldiers' Home now Westwood, but Sawtell, it was called at the time. And Lyman Stewart was himself a Civil War veteran and had a real heart for those old soldiers that were there in the home. And he set up and financed another Bible woman, Helen Fish, who has over 40 letters that she wrote to him over the 2 decades that she was there. Many of them very moving. And again, it was $25 a month. He paid for the mission. He provided other funding for food and things like that, and he encouraged others to support them as well. Trying to make time here.
You're doing great.
We're okay?
You're doing great.
Here's a little bit more on the San Fernando mission. The Los Angeles Times reported in 1902 that on the ground floor of the San Fernando mission was a restaurant, kitchen, reading room, auditorium, and schoolroom for industrial classes. In the basement were 150 wayfarers, homeless. The second floor was for residents who've proven themselves capable of better management of their lives. More orderly residents. Other than that, you're down in the basement. Which they managed through a sifting process. The third floor was a hospital. Food distribution is provided to poor families. A section of the house provided living space for Christian workers. Many of the Bible women lived in this house, in little rooms or shared rooms. And it says here, outfitted by, quote, a gentleman of wealth in this city who refuses to have his name made public. This is clearly a hallmark of Lyman Stewart, and indeed his correspondence reveals he is the man who supported this. The Sawtell mission. Frances Fish reported that she had 2 other part-time workers, who were, quote, abundantly filled with the Holy Ghost. Look out. The rent was paid by Stewart, and they visited the residents of the soldier home daily. About 40 faithfully attended their Sunday and midweek worship service at the mission. Fish's monthly reports are filled with individual details concerning prayers for the sick, hand-holding the dying soldiers and praying them home to heaven. Sheltering the homeless, who the soldiers' home turned away because they lacked the pension department documents to gain them entry, or were, quote, what they called the sad and broken sons of the Confederacy, who were not allowed in the soldiers' home. Bodies were fed and shelter was provided, but mostly it was care for the soul. Francis wrote in 1904, quote, I found an old gentleman, 70 years old, reading a book on the porch. He was broken-hearted over the death of his 2 sons and a dear little baby granddaughter. With tears running down his face, he said, I surely need something to give me peace. Perhaps the most substantial enduring legacy of these urban activists is the Union Rescue Mission, initially called the Pacific Gospel Union, which was founded by Lyman Stewart and these other pious businessmen in 1891. The first superintendent, Major George A. Hilton, was brought out by Lyman Stewart, another Civil War veteran who had started a rescue mission in Washington, D.C., where many, many thousands of Civil War veterans had just kind of collected after the war. They never went home. You know, after they were drummed out of the service, they just kind of fell apart. And George Hilton had done very effective work in Washington. Lyman Stewart brought him here to Los Angeles, and they began to hold street meetings. No building yet, but they did have wagons, and they held meetings typically at Hobo Corner, which we walked on the tour. First in Los Angeles Street. These pictures are taken over a period of 2.5 decades, so that was a favorite spot for what was called Christian street activity in Los Angeles. I have a few more women I want to talk about. Do I have a few more minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
Women who were pregnant, abused, needed shelter, or had run away from houses of prostitution sought rescue and refuge in the Doors of Hope. A Doors of Hope was founded by Lyman Stewart, of course, in 1903, reported in the Los Angeles Times. They said, quote, for rescuing the many unfortunate women of Los Angeles. Whittemore, who founded this concept, she herself was a former prostitute in New York, the Bowery of New York. There are pictures here on the right. She founded over 300 Doors of Hope around the country. One of them in Los Angeles. And she loved to post these before and after photos. You know, these are real before and after of a lost and reclaimed, transformed street sex worker in New York, kind of like the Nutrisystem, you know, before and after shots on TV, you know. Just
the confession that was the Union Rescue Mission did. These testimonials were the vessel by which they went around. These life transformations.
Realized, and many of them became workers, you know, in the Doors of Hope homes because their lives had been turned around. Belle White, a famous Los Angeles Bible woman, she was one of the first Bible women of the Union Rescue Mission of the Pacific Gospel Union. She ran a church for the homeless on Main Street, the Peniel Mission Church. She was part of the holiness group, so she was a preacher, you know, which was very unusual for women back then, and a young lady. She was just in her 20s. She started an orphanage, unofficial orphanage, not a state-chartered orphanage, but a home for the homeless children. She started children's Sunday school, which had hundreds of kids, you know, coming in Boyle Heights, and she had the home of the former mayor, Hazard, donated to her.
Wow.
He really supported her work. I wish I knew more about him, but it's
We'll help you.
3701 Cesar Chavez Avenue today, but it's called East Side Avenue back then. And the city, the LA Times reports the city and the state were always after her, trying to shut her down, as an unlicensed, house of charity. But she continued to do her good work.
Did she have a reason for not wishing to be licensed?
When the State Board of Charities began licensing these charitable homes, and there were a number of what we would call, very religious institutions that were doing Bible instruction and doctrine and what have you, the State Board of Charities forbade certain religious instruction, unless it met, very, criteria of being voluntary, and she didn't comply with that, and so. That was the major thing, and I think the other thing is that she wanted to do, a different kind of work than the charities. The State Board of Charities wanted to do strictly kind of shelter and feeding and things, and she had a more robust agenda. There's a great little report that the LA Times says here. Many letters from Belle White to Lyman Stewart, in which she talks to him about her work with the young people. She says, "Oh, some of the miserable homes I've been led to by my children. At first I was regarded by the fathers and mothers in a somewhat curious way, but when they found my motive was no other than love for the little ones and that I wanted to help them, they were very kind. And now the parents too give me credit and attend the services with the children. After an hour and a half of service, we play games. I teach them our beautiful songs and Bible verses, and I tell in as interesting way as I can about Jesus. After that, I taught them to repeat the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, and together then send them home. And our little happy workers' society has grown to over 160 children. Very sweet." The Los Angeles Times reported in 1897, quote, "They who serve the Lord with ragtime songs and cakewalk accompaniment at the 6th and Mateo Street Church have established a lodging house led by Belle White, a meeting house, and general headquarters of a ludicrous bunch of fanatics." She kept going. Asian missions. I'm just about wrapping up. It's amazing to me the interest that Lyman Stewart and his brother Milton had in the Asian people of Los Angeles. Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. The early group here in Los Angeles was the Chinese, and he had over 225 Chinese members of the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in 1890. Started their own church in their community and a clinic, to serve their medical needs. Dr. B.C. Atterbury, who was also on the board of the Union Rescue Mission and on the board of the Bible Institute, had been the first Presbyterian missionary in Peking, China. His wife got sick in 1890, and he came back to the States and moved to Pasadena. But he spent all of his time here working in the cities among the Asian people that he had left behind in China. He had been on the Royal Commission for the abolition of the opium trade, so he knew all about addiction, okay, and fought it in clinics in Peking. He set them up here in Los Angeles. Again, the city did not want him to establish these clinics. They felt that it attracted undesirable elements. He and Lyman moved the center of their operations to where most of the Chinese were in San Francisco. And I have pictures here of one of the Bible women of Los Angeles, Donaldina Cameron, who grew up in the Lucky Baldwin estate. Her father was a Scottish shepherd, who took care of the livestock in the huge Puente Rancho. And she attended the normal school and then the Bible Institute, or a predecessor of the Bible Institute. And then he sent her up to San Francisco, and she worked in I think I have the name of it, the Occidental Mission Home, which was the Presbyterian home to the Chinese community of San Francisco. Lyman Stewart paid for this building, which exists today as a historic monument on 920 Sacramento Street in Chinatown. In the San Francisco earthquake, the city was blowing up buildings trying to stop the fire from racing through the city, and so they blew up the building. Wow. And Lyman Stewart rebuilt it using the old bricks, from the original building. He says, we don't want to change anything about what's going on here. That's an outstanding commitment. Donaldina Cameron became quite famous. In fact, she's one Bible woman that 2 books have been written about her that are exceptional. One about 40 years ago and one just in the last 10 years. And a movie, Broken Trail, which I haven't seen, but I remember seeing it, and I want to get it because I just learned about this. But it was a story of these cowboys who were taking a group of on a wagon train up to the Northwest, right around 1900, and they found they had a bunch of Chinese women, that were on the wagon train with a couple of rough-looking men, and they were carrying up to houses of prostitution in Seattle and Portland, and they were sex slaves. And so these cowboys discovered this, and it's a wonderful story of how they decide that they've got to do the right thing, with these girls. Even though these men, had papers saying that they were, immigrants and they had husbands, in Seattle and Portland and what have you. And so these guys liberate them and return them to this home for refuge Chinese women, sex slaves in San Francisco, the Donaldina Cameron House. So she's this, minor figure, but a very important figure that created a huge impact on the Chinese community in San Francisco. This building today is called the Cameron House. It's the center of the social organizations of the Chinese community. And the alley that used to be called, it was the alley where most of the Chinese brothels were, is called Cameron Alley today in honor of her. So she's quite a lady, perhaps the most distinguished of the Bible women. The work and contact that she had with the people here in Los Angeles, with the Bible Institute, with Lyman and Milton Stewart, they continued to fund her work until the end of her life. I want to close with the story of the first Bible woman. This was perhaps the most difficult for me to uncover, although I had more letters written by this woman to Lyman Stewart than any other Bible woman. The first one was dated in 1892 from Josephine Cowgill. She began writing detailed monthly reports to Stewart, providing a vivid and compassionate account of her activities. She continued to write for the next 20 years, except for a 4-year break in service when she went to Palestine to serve as a medical missionary in Tiberias and Jaffa. Because of this extensive correspondence, I feel I know her better than any of the other Bible women, and I often wondered what this soul looked like. And I was finally able to obtain a digital image of her in a book written by another Bible woman from New Orleans, Sister Elizabeth Wheaton, who ran a rescue home for prostitutes, female ex-convicts, and others, quote, of the worst class. But certainly she was not a burlesque beauty, but she had a heart of gold, and Josephine reported that she learned from Sister Wheaton how to kneel and pray in front of houses of prostitution and sing hymns in front of saloons, drawing crowds and giving testimony. She said there was usually one or more of the crowd who would remain trembling and weeping, convicted of sin. There's a report in the Los Angeles Herald of her and Sister Wheaton being arrested in a saloon in San Pedro, actually beaten up. because Sister Beaton looked exactly like Carrie Nation. I don't know if you've heard of Carrie Nation, but she used to go around with an axe and broke up saloons all over the country. And so when dear Josephine and Sister Beaton came into this saloon, to pray and make people feel terrible, they beat her up. And so then the saloon keeper was arrested, and he apologized profusely, and he paid her doctor's bills, and he said, I was sure it was Carrie Nation and she was about to destroy the place. Calgill lived in extreme modesty at the Pacific Gospel Union, supported by her $25 a month. For her 65th birthday, Stewart delighted her with what she called my wonderful bed. In her thank you note, she wrote, quote, it seems to me there can be no happier work this side of heaven than just the sweet little service my blessed master has given to me, unquote. He often sent her special cash gifts, which she usually managed to give away to foreign missionaries or others in need. She wrote back, quote, a pilgrim for God's travels must travel light. Indeed she did. When she died, Stewart sent her body, along with her belongings, to her family back in Ohio. All her possessions fit in a small valise. One of Stewart's favorite Bible verses was from the New Testament, and he was fond of quoting it, especially to rich businessmen with which he associated. It's St. Paul's epistle to his disciple Timothy. Charge them that are rich in this world that they be not high-minded, nor trust in earthly riches, but in the living God, who richly provideth all good things, that they do good, that they become rich in good works, ready to communicate, willing to distribute, laying up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold of eternal life. This was the first of the Bible women, and this was the last of the Bible women, a picture taken in 1958. Mrs. Lula Stewart is right here. Lyman and a wealthy woman named Fanny Barlow, another eminent Los Angeles, left them a little trust to support them, which they did, health care and housing, and what little they need or needed was provided until the end. Thank you.
Are there any questions? I know we started a little late. I sort of want to give us a break before we start with Leslie. But are there any questions? Yes.
Why? Thank you first for that very interesting lecture. Why these women disappeared? Why the Bible women disappeared, and why the last one, the history is from 1958?
Why did they survive so long?
No, why they disappeared?
They disappeared. Well, a couple of things. Our society changed. The Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which funded these, there was a building in LA, that sat there until Biola moved in 1957, and a lot of the women lived there, as residents, in the hotels, lived very modest lives and, taught Bible lessons and things like that, and there were some amazing, and hilarious stories, the women, started to go, as they got older, and they were difficult to take care of, but they loved them, and even the students, loved them as well, as precious as they were. I think that because urban LA changed and became suburban, this door-to-door visitation and the kind of work that they did was not the kind of work that Christian evangelical workers thought was the best investment of their time. And I will say this though, there are people doing this kind of work in LA today, among the various Christian missions that are in the neighborhoods, working in institutions, knowing the people, living with them, loving them, and all of that. So it does go on, although the Bible Women as an organized institution is no longer with us.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to take a 10-minute break. I want to get to Leslie. Okay, so it's, what time is it? It is 10 after? It's 10 after. Let's come back at 20 after, and Leslie will get you started. Okay, good. Paul, you're not done. Come back up. I just want to say one or two more things. This is really important stuff that you're talking about. I will take 30 seconds to give you some threads to follow. So settlement houses. Settlement houses were really the nexus of how Stewart worked with these women. Okay, if you look at the history of settlement houses in East Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, Paulina Schindler, wife of Rudolph Schindler, came out to Los Angeles. She was a smithy. She, with a bunch of friends, she tried to get Rudolph Schindler a commission at the Walt Whitman School in Boyle Heights back in 1918. So Rudolph Schindler's one of his big early commissions was supposed to be this school that was attached to a settlement house. So you have this really interesting thread of progressives and socialists and artists. So just it's all in Boyle Heights, like around 1907. It's really interesting stuff. So thank you for all of your digging. Okay, everyone, thank you.
Yeah.